Many of us find it's not easy to think clearly about today's public policy issues. It's even more difficult to think about them in a thoroughly Christian, biblical manner.
You go in and to the polling booth and I will leave some empty because I don't know anything about either of them. All these different precincts are just like, okay, I don't even recognize those names, we're just gonna leave them empty, you know? And then like, that's ridiculous. I don't even know the names of the people I'm supposed to be voting for.
I hardly even listen to it anymore because I feel like everybody is saying the same thing. Everybody's just trying to appeal to the public and get votes, and it doesn't seem to me that there are many politicians, if any, out there that are truly interested in the betterment of the country, and it is frustrating.
I tend to get more frustrated by public policy debates when the people seem to talk past each other.
We all live such busy lives today, and we're all busy with the kids and the family and school and work, so it's not always easy to stay informed on all of the issues.
Have you ever felt the way these people feel? I know I have. I suspect most of you have felt this way at one time or the other, or maybe most of the time. As a result, social scientists report that most of us, instead of thinking through public policy questions for ourselves, simply adopt positions on issues and candidates based on our family backgrounds, our occupations, the income group we are in, and the communities in which we live.
I think we should do better than that. I mean, sometimes it may seem rational, but I think we should do better than that.
Well, the basic thing is that we do live in a fallen world, and the book of Romans is very clear about this, that we're surrounded, we're immersed in fallenness. And there's a real danger that we'll simply go along with. We'll conform our thinking to the patterns of a fallen world. And this is certainly true with questions of public policy. And we're also today, of course, surrounded by so many ideologies. I mean, you have the right wing and the left wing, and people, who want to distinguish themselves from each of those wings. And it's so easy for us to sort of pick one of the ideologies and subscribe to it.
We all sense there must be a better way. Paul in Romans lays out the starting point for that better way. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But what does this mean when it comes to the political world and public policy issues and controversies? I find that sometimes a concrete example can help us to see what is needed. We can go back 200 years to Britain for one such shining example.
In 1785, the slave trade was the mainstay of the British economy. Cruelty seemed to know no limits, as men and women were dragged from their African homes, packed onto ships, transported to the West Indies, and sold for huge profits. Many died in the process. 1785 was also the year God called William Wilberforce, the 26-year-old member of Parliament, to full commitment to him. Wilberforce spent the rest of his life in Parliament, working year in and year out to end the slave trade and to enact a host of other reforms that changed England forever.
Wilberforce's conversion played every role in his life in politics. I don't think there's anyone who can honestly study the period of history and study Wilberforce's life and come to any conclusion except that his faith brought him to take on the slave trade. Anybody who was not of a serious Christian faith couldn't believe that the slave trade was wrong. They'd lived with it for so long. It only was the serious Christians, in those days they scorned them as Methodists and enthusiasts. It's only the very serious Christians, as Wilberforce had become, who believed the slave trade was actually wrong. And so there's just no way to see it except that it was his conversion that led him to take on slavery and the slave trade. That's indisputable. It was just a brutal battle such that he had to be encouraged by God. God called him to it. He got a letter from John Wesley saying that you're going to need to know that this is going to be a place where you have to rely on God. You can't do this on your own. And I'm sure that he wouldn't have been able to see it through if he hadn't been relying on God completely. One of the joys for me of the life of Wilberforce is to see that he was one of those Christians who was thoroughly in the world and thoroughly not of the world. He was somebody that he didn't just have this compartmentalized Christian life. He wanted to be familiar with all of the great works of politics and literature and history so that he could be a better Christian in the real world, so that he could translate his faith into these areas. So it wouldn't just be about theology. It wouldn't just be about talking to people about salvation. It would be about everything. He wanted to know how his faith, how taking the Bible seriously translates into every sphere. And it really was something that was almost unique in his time.
William Wilberforce was truly not conformed to the pattern of his 18th century world because he was transformed by the renewing of his mind. We, I am convinced, are called to do no less in our day. It is only as we do so that we can be used by God to influence our communities and nation for the good. Now, I don't want to pretend this is an easy task. Like anything else in our walk with Christ, it requires careful thought, prayer, and, most importantly, a willingness to be guided by the Bible and its truths.
I really like something John Stott, the great British evangelical, once said to a group of us back in the early days of sort of evangelical social action stuff. He said, we all need to be conservative radicals. We need to be conservative about one thing and one thing alone, and that is the absolute truth and authority of God's Word. Everything else in the light of God's Word we need to subject to critical scrutiny. And that means we have to work hard as Christians to stand back and to say, are the voices that I'm hearing around me saying things that fit with what God says in the Scriptures? And that's an ongoing task.
This video series and my book on which it is based are designed to help us to be transformed in our minds so that we will not be simply good citizens, but good Christian citizens. In doing this, we will be guided by certain truths God has given us in His Word. The next 4 segments introduce 4 key biblical principles that will help us to evaluate today's public policy questions, and then the next 7 segments illustrate how these 4 principles can be applied to 7 key public policy areas.
In the following chapters of this video series, we will consider the meaning of justice.
I just want to repeat that. This is not about charity, it's about justice.
We will consider the appropriateness of the questions our leaders sometimes ask us.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
We will consider biblical principles that lead to neither liberal nor conservative conclusions.
Well, if you're a liberal, you're going to have a problem with subsidiarity. If you're a conservative, you're going to have a problem with subsidiarity.
We will consider the place of the family and other civil society institutions in God's will for our society.
He leaned across the table, pointed his finger right in my face, and he said, when those children cross the schoolhouse door, they're mine. The parents have nothing to say about it. I control everything.
We will consider our responsibilities as stewards of God's creation.
And we're kind of squeezing a lot of God's other creatures out. We're taking away their provision that God gave to them. That's not stewardship. As one of my colleagues says, extinction isn't stewardship.
And we will consider our responsibilities as Christians while our nation fights a war on terror.
We cannot be carried away by anger, by a spirit of vengeance, by winning at any cost. And we have a special obligation to tell the world that terrorism isn't the biggest threat. What's the biggest threat is that we be separated from the love of God in Jesus Christ.
This world is a place of almost indescribable beauty. But it is also a place of almost indescribable evil and pain. And yet again, there are those who risk their lives to save others and bring healing where there is pain.
As we begin our exploration of biblical principles that will help us to understand today's public policies in a biblical Christian manner, we begin with God's good and perfect creation and how it was spoiled.
You know, a lot of the pictures in the Christian art that we get of the garden sort of show Adam and Eve sort of lounging around in the garden, but we get a very different feel for what God had in mind in creating them and placing them in a garden from the Genesis account. God placed human beings in a kind of raw garden, but they have begun to fill that garden with the works of human hands, technology and schedules and labeling systems and all that kind of thing. And in all of that, they are to glorify God. They're to do all these things to the glory of God. And so we get a kind of work in the garden that God places them. And this is the filling of the garden with the products of human labor.
But something went tragically wrong in God's perfect garden. Adam and Eve rebelled against their Maker when they ate of the one tree they had been told not to eat. The world is no longer as it is supposed to be. It is broken. The hearts and wills of human beings, including our own hearts and wills, are not as they are supposed to be.
Then not long after the fall, they try to build a tower that reaches to the heavens. That is, their technological activity becomes an act of disobedience to God, a serving of their own sinful impulses. Cain and Abel is another good example of the ways in which the fall of our first parents spread into murder.
The great Russian Christian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn expressed the tragic truth accurately. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn is right when he says the line between good and evil runs through all human beings' hearts. This means evil lies in the hearts not only of the Osama bin Ladens of the world, but also in our nation's leaders and politicians and in the hearts of us as citizens and voters. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The political world as we see it today is not as it is supposed to be. But, and this is crucial, sin and the resulting evil is not the end of the Christian story. It is only the beginning.
Christians who are sensitive to the defection, rebellion, folly in the world are sometimes in danger of presenting a message that sounds like this. It sounds like, I've got some bad news for you, and I've got some bad news for you. But that's to forget that the center of the Christian world is not our sin, but our Savior. That's the center of the gospel message.
Yeah, there's an old theological slogan that I love. It says, redemption restores creation. And if we're created to glorify God in all that we do, in our personal relationships, in the way we treat the non-human creation, the way we raise animals and raise crops, we have to take seriously what the apostle says, that whatsoever you do in word and deed, do all to the honor and glory of God. That when we're redeemed by Jesus Christ, he wants to redeem all of life, all of that which was broken and wounded by sin.
The biblical message is that the whole world belongs to God. The whole world has fallen, and so the whole world has to be redeemed. Every person, place, people group, organization, program, system. That's a very big worldview and a very big view of who Jesus Christ is.
This very big view of Jesus Christ and what he came to do includes the political world. The political world belongs to God, The political world has fallen, and so the political world needs to be redeemed.
Salvation from sin is certainly helpful once we die. However, it's also very helpful while we're alive, too. I mean, to be saved from sin and to continue to live in sin is a contradictory. So obviously, it has to mean something now.
Yeah, I mean, if we really take seriously this idea that we're born again, that we're made new people in Christ, then that ought to, be in evidence in our relationships with other people and how we conduct our daily lives and, how we go out into the world and interact with it.
Well, I think that Christ has called us to action, and so there's a direct correlation to public policy in that the actions that we take as members of a society, we are calling on our government to feed the hungry and to house the homeless and to clothe the naked and to visit those in prison. So I think as Christians we do have an obligation to take action as Christ called us to take action. And if you think about if Christ were to return today, where would he go and what would he do? He probably wouldn't come to visit my church or your church. He would probably go down to some red light district or find a skid row where he could reach out to those people that he came to save.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we're called to redeem the parts of the world that we can. One of the liberating messages of the resurrection is that the world doesn't have to stay the way that it is. And, we as the church are called to be or embody Christ in this world until he comes again. At the same time, while he's already come and the victory's already won, it's not yet and won't be fully realized until he comes again. We still live in a fallen world that's imperfect, where evil reigns and violence is rampant, and I think we need to take that into consideration when we start thinking about public policy.
I came across this quote by Martin Luther King Jr., and he said, "How can you say that you're passionate about souls when you're indifferent toward the slums in which those souls reside?"
This is not about charity in the end, is it? It's about justice. The good news yet to come. I just want to repeat that. This is not about charity, it's about justice. And that's too bad, because we're good at charity. Americans, Irish people are good at charity. We like to give, and we give a lot, even those who can't afford it. But justice is a higher standard. Africa makes a fool of our idea of justice. It makes a farce of our idea of equality. It mocks our pieties, it doubts our concern, and it questions our commitment. 6,500 Africans are still dying every day of a preventable, treatable disease. For lack of drugs we can buy in any drugstore. This is not about charity. This is about justice and equality.
Bono spoke eloquently of justice to the assembled elite of Washington at the National Prayer Breakfast. And it is well he did. Justice is central to the Bible's understanding of governments and the public policies they pursue.
To understand justice in public life, it is first important to understand two truths the Bible teaches us. One is that God has established governments. The Bible teaches there are three institutions God has established: marriage, the church, and government. Proverbs declares, "By me kings reign and rulers make laws that are just." And Paul in Romans writes there is no governing authority except that which God has established. A second truth the Bible teaches is that God established governments in order for them to promote justice in a world that no longer is as it is supposed to be. When the Israelites, after wandering in the desert for 40 years, were ready to enter the land God had promised them, God gave these instructions to Moses: appoint judges and officials for each of your tribes in every town the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall judge the people fairly. Follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you. Clearly, the Bible teaches governments have been established by Him in order to promote justice. But all this still leaves a crucial question. What is justice?
Justice is giving every person his or her due. And that means that in doing justice, we need to give people what they have coming to them. And normally that means that we owe them good things. But if they have violated laws, if they have ruptured relationships, then justice also means to repair things, to restore things, and even in some cases to engage in punishment of people who have done some things that they really owe some kind of penalty to the rest of society. When we don't pay people a proper wage, that's not giving them what is due to them. When we don't tell the truth to people, we are not giving them what is due to them. St. Augustine once said that we even owed our enemies compassion when that's the appropriate thing. And so there's a lot of stuff in the world today that is out of balance. And to do justice is to restore the balance. It's to make things right again.
An idea closely related to justice is the common good. If a government is truly seeking justice for all its people, the common good, not the good of certain narrow special interests, will be advanced.
I like to think of common good as being, we're all in the same boat together. As the people of God, everybody is God's children, and so we try to work with one another to ensure the best for all God's people. Looking out for old number one is the opposite, really, of the common good. And I think, especially in modern American culture, we're so inundated, I think, with whether it be messages from Hollywood or from corporate advertising that plays on some of our weaknesses in this area. And as Christians, we are part of a whole different culture that we're reminded of every Sunday, and hopefully beyond that in our personal devotional time, that we're really about a higher sort of perspective and calling, and that our drive in life isn't just to realize our own personal gain or to reach our own personal goals, but to work for all God's children.
But what exactly does all this talk about justice and the common good have to do with us as citizens and voters? This is what I like to call the so what question. And this is my response. In our actions as citizens, as we vote, as we express our opinions, as we sign petitions, we Christians should support public policies that advance justice and the common good. Of this I am certain. But I must quickly admit, this answer only sets us on the right path. It does not lead us home. What remains to be answered is this question: how can we, in specific, concrete situations, determine what positions support the common good or justice?
Common good it's a very lofty idea, but what I think people struggle with is that you can talk about the common good and espouse the common good, but take education, for example. If someone said that a kid born in Michigan is going to get a better education than a kid born in Mississippi, people would say, oh, well, we should have equal education across the United States of America. But then when a politician stood up and said, now give me your tax dollar and we're going to ship some of that off to Mississippi and improve the standard of education there. Whoa, wait a minute. You're going to take money from my kid's school? And suddenly the idea of common good goes right out the window.
Neither here nor elsewhere in this video series Am I going to proclaim boldly what justice or the common good means in every and all situations? The world is too complex, and my own wisdom too limited to attempt that. The important thing is that we as Christians seek after justice and the common good as best we can, learning from each other and applying what insights God has given us. Perhaps we can begin that process by considering several examples.
For 15 years, a controversy has raged over a 43-foot cross on city property at the top of Mount Soledad in the San Diego area. Some groups have gone all the way to the United States Supreme Court to force its removal. Meanwhile, many Christians are vigorously fighting against its removal. Now take another issue. Several years ago, the Evangelical Environmental Network issued a statement that read in part, "One consequence of our misuse of the earth is an unjust denial of God's created bounty to other human beings."
Here we have two issues, one involving a large cross on public property and one involving environmental pollution. What do you think? Do both issues involve justice and the common good? Does neither one? Or maybe one does involve justice and the other one does not? To answer these questions, we need to ask if one or the other more fully and clearly involves whether or not people are receiving that which is due them as God intends. Equally sincere Christians may disagree on the answer they give to this question, but the question is the right one, and the one we as Bible-believing Christians ought to be asking. Let's take another example. In 2003, the governor of Alabama, Bob Riley, who is an evangelical Christian, urged a tax reform package on the basis that the Alabama tax system was unjust.
Fairness and justice as applied to taxation, and that's how I got pulled into all of this, requires more from the most of us if your system is out of whack. That message is about as well received as you need a root canal next week. I think it's very, and I've often been challenged in churches. Now that's wrong, Professor. Because the church is charitable, and we're giving, and we're loving, and we make an A in charity. And I said, yeah, we sure do make an A in charity, and we make an F in justice, and it doesn't average out to a C.
I think that an unjust tax structure would be one in which one segment of society pays a disproportionate payment compared to another.
I think to some degree, those of us who can afford to put more money into our tax structure should do it, and we should do it with a willingness that we're helping everybody.
I think both sides have arguments rooted in justice. What's the fair distribution of taxes?
So my own, conception of justice, the way I would feel about it would be a way to get each side paying the same percentage of their income.
I guess personally I'm not opposed to a progressive tax system, but I do think it's hard to make, bright distinctions between just and unjust. I think there's a case to be made for both sides in terms of justice, and probably we should, it's hard to make it just purely a moral issue because of that.
On the morning of May 10, 1940, the armies of Nazi Germany attacked the Netherlands, spreading death and destruction. In 3 days, the country was overrun. The Dutch surrendered, and the dark night of Nazi occupation settled over the land. As in all of Europe where Hitler's armies had conquered, Jews were in grave danger. The Nazis began rounding up Dutch Jews and sending them to concentration camps and to their deaths. Some among the Dutch resisted and offered help to their fellow citizens who were Jews, even at the risk of their own lives. Among them was Diet Eman, then a 20-year-old woman whose Christian conscience would not allow her to sit idly by.
Well, I worked in a bank in the international section, and next to me was a Jewish guy, and he worked there too, and his name was Herman, and he loved to play violin, and my brother plays beautiful cello. He was in many orchestras. He could have been a professional, and I play horrible piano. But Herman wanted to play trios, so he came often to our house, and he became a friend.
Diet Eman, her fiancé Heinz Sietsma, and others hid Jews with Christian Dutch farm families and provided food and crucial ration cards for them.
Can we do what can we? You can't let that pass. That are friends, and they hadn't done any crime. And we didn't know later that they would be killed. But then Hein got a great idea because his father was principal of a Christian grade school. And they had he was the oldest of 10 children. And he said, Diet, I know all those farmers. The kids, they sent their kids to my father's school. And we get our milk and our butter and our cheese, and I know them all. And he said, if I hop on the train, because we lived in The Hague, and this was Nijkerk, he said, if I hop on the train and I ask any of those farmers, will you take Herman till the end of the war? They'll say yes. So we called Herman back, and I met him again, and I told him. And he said, yes, please, and my sister and my girlfriend and the mother of my girlfriend. And in a few weeks we had I think that we had around 60 people that we found places for.
Towards the end of the war, Hein was caught by the Nazis and was sent to Dachau concentration camp in Germany, where he died in January of 1945. By their courageous actions, Diet and Hein have given us a moving example of what solidarity with others in need means. Today, Diet still testifies to the love of Christ that led her to stand in solidarity with her fellow Dutch citizens who were Jews.
We thought that's what Jesus would have done. I mean, do unto others what you want others to do unto you. And we definitely did not want to leave our home, so you had to help. That's what we felt was God's will. You had to. It was not a matter, do you like it? It was really a matter of obedience. And then you have to trust God. And I mean, it was hard that Hein didn't come back. And first I didn't want to live either. I wanted to die because from the 15 guys of our group, 8 never came back. And I didn't want to live either. But then slowly it dawns on you. If you're not taken, God has other plans.
The parable of the Good Samaritan is a wonderful lesson that Jesus taught about solidarity. For one thing, it was the solidarity between the Samaritan and the victim lying along the side of the road. That he saw a person in need, and it was a Samaritan looking at a Jew and saying, I need to help that person. Why? Because that person is another human being who's desperately in need. And I'm obligated to stop and to serve the needs of that person. But there's another layer to the story, and that is that Jesus was telling this to Jews who didn't like Samaritans. And he was wanting them to see the Samaritan as a good example to them, as someone who they should feel solidarity with, as someone who understood the need to serve those who are helpless.
Yeah, when I think of solidarity, the first thing that comes to mind is the biblical passage in which Cain kills Abel and God says, where is your brother? And Cain cynically says, am I my brother's keeper? And I sometimes get tears in my eyes when I think about that passage in the Bible. To me, that's the crux of some of the situations we're in today, in which Many of us are standing around cynically asking, well, am I my brother's keeper? Should I really be concerned about people dying of AIDS in Africa, or should I really be concerned about poor people in the inner city? The answer in Scripture overwhelmingly is yes, we are our brother's keeper.
The solidarity principle is one of the key principles in all of Scripture to best understand how we should engage as evangelical Christians in the political arena.
We need to carefully consider exactly what solidarity is, how it is taught in Scripture, and what it means for us today.
Solidarity is undoubtedly a Christian virtue. One's neighbor is then a living image of God the Father, redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ. One must be ready for sacrifice, even the ultimate one, to lay down one's life.
Solidarity is, I would say, it is probably as polar opposite a concept as you can get from the idea of the individual sovereign self. You can't separate the individual from the human community in Catholic social teaching and Catholic social thought. The individual is a part of a human family that extends not only to one's own literal family and community and friends, but really the whole human family, and as well, and frankly, as persons who may even be considered strangers or even enemies. So individual need, individual material want. Solidarity basically is a clarion call to consider the well-being of others in virtually everything that we do.
I agree with Dilulio's basic notion that we, as Christians, have to be concerned about the good of others, and we have to see others' humanity, even in our enemies, recognize their humanity and take into consideration their needs.
And I think it definitely represents the ideal of solidarity, because there's, neither male nor female, neither Greek nor Jew, and on down the line. And that's a really difficult concept, I think, for myself and others as Christians to deal with. But it's ultimately what Christ would want.
I think of like coming alongside someone. Like if you choose solidarity with a group, you're choosing to come alongside them, like someone who moves into a very low-income neighborhood, not because they need a low-income housing situation, but because they want to come alongside the people that live there and say, I value you. Your neighborhood is worth living in.
Clearly, solidarity is a Christian virtue. We are to love our neighbors as ourselves. But that still leaves us with the so what question. When and how should we translate our Christ-motivated concern for those in need into positions on the public policy controversies of the day? Let no one pretend this is an easy question. One thing is clear. Sometimes our politicians, in their drive to get our votes, ask us the wrong question.
Next Tuesday is Election Day. Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, will stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
I don't know that it's a good question to ask. It's an individualistic question to ask, am I better off? And if you're going to vote based on that.
In some regards, I think, though, that it's a terrible question, if we think about it from a Christian perspective.
Solidarity says that Ronald Reagan here asked the wrong question. For Christians, the question is not whether or not we are personally better off today, but whether our neighbors and our country as a whole are better off.
I think far too often we reach for politics first, and we don't give due consideration to what we can do personally, or what we can do locally as a church, or what we can do in nonprofit organizations. And so I guess that's why I'm troubled by how solidarity is often interpreted. It seems like the people who talk about solidarity most often are the ones that are most quickly reaching for politics, and that leaves me really troubled.
It's wrong to interpret solidarity to mean we should quickly turn to government whenever we see needs about which solidarity has moved us to be concerned. However, and this is equally true, it is also wrong to interpret solidarity to mean that we should never turn to government when we see a need. After all, government is the God-given means to promote greater justice in our land. We need to be guided by specific circumstances and conditions. The well-known Catholic scholar and former member of the Bush administration, John Dilulio, has struck, I believe, the right balance.
You don't turn to government first. You can't be addicted to government when it comes to helping the poor and the needy, but neither should you be allergic to government. And the obligation is to first do what you can do as an individual. That is, help should be delivered where possible, up close and personal. But if and when you're up against a social need that is bigger than you and maybe bigger than your family, your community, your network of churches and so forth, then you have a positive moral obligation to continue to seek help and engage others to meet the needs of the poor or the needy or the neglected or the sick or the elderly or the dying. And that requirement will sometimes bring one to call upon the largest community, say the national political community represented by our democratic government.
Today, thousands of Christian families have chosen to homeschool their children, fearing the secularizing influences of the public schools. Sometimes these parents have run into trouble with the public school authorities.
I remember a situation in probate court where a family was taken to court and parents were prosecuted for educationally neglecting their children, was the charge. And we showed up at court for a pretrial, and I walk into this room. Usually a pretrial is just the prosecutor and yourself, and you're sitting down trying to resolve a case. And I walk into this room, and it's the county commissioner room, and there's 15, 16 people all around the table. Everybody from the superintendent of the whole school district, assistant superintendents and principals, the prosecutor, protective services workers. It was really quite amazing. I walked into the room, here are all these people, I sit down. They start immediately trying to get me to agree that my clients will plead guilty, and here's what they're going to do in their benevolence, to be nice to my people, and they won't throw them in jail and those kinds of things. And as we started talking, and I told them, well, that wasn't going to happen. We were going to have a trial, and it started getting a little heated. The superintendent was sitting right across the table from me, and he was being quite antagonistic through this meeting. So finally I looked at him and I said, well, sir, if you hadn't arrested my client for simply coming to the school to pick up her children because they had a family emergency, which is what occurred, and that's what precipitated my client starting the homeschooling. I said, if you hadn't arrested her for coming to get her children, maybe we wouldn't be sitting here today. And, he got very angry, and he leaned across the table, pointed his finger right in my face, and he said, when those children cross the schoolhouse door, they're mine. The parents have nothing to say about it. I control everything.
Homeschooling parents who have run into trouble with the authorities due to the way they have chosen to educate their children help to illustrate a basic point. For God intends human societies to consist of millions of individuals and a government that unites all these millions under a system of laws. But we must not stop there. There is more, much more. In between us as individuals and an entire society and its government, there are a host of other institutions and organizations. Think of various clubs and associations, of charitable organizations offering help to those in need, of sports leagues, and most importantly, because they have been explicitly established by God, think of the family and the church. All these institutions and organizations make up what is usually called civil society. When the government interferes with parents who are homeschooling their children, it is interfering with a civil society institution, the family, that has been given as much responsibility and the freedom to carry out that responsibility by God Himself.
To understand the importance of civil society and God's intent for human societies, it is helpful to go back 100 years to a Dutch pastor, writer, and politician. An idea he called sphere sovereignty is still helpful to us today.
Well, Abraham Kuyper was a multi-talented, very energetic, resourceful man who was born around 1840 in the Netherlands and died in 1920. Kuyper thought that human life fell into discrete spheres or we might call domains of activity or fields of activity. We are by nature, by our created being, we are naturally religious people, we are naturally economic people, we are naturally knowledge searchers, we're naturally artistic people. So Kuyper was very fearful that with the example of a right-wing government such as existed at that time in Germany, or a left-wing government such as in that day existed in France, that from either side, governments were way too tempted, way too inclined to intrude in these domains of human behavior where the governments have no competency and really no business going. I mean, government doesn't know how to teach your kid, government doesn't know how to run a lab, government doesn't know how to draw a painting. And so he wanted these various domains to remain as autonomous or to have as much sovereignty as possible.
In 1891, Pope Leo XIII issued an encyclical in which he discussed what he termed subsidiarity. This idea continues to play a key role in Catholic social thought and is basically similar to Abraham Kuyper's idea of sphere sovereignty.
But the principle of solidarity is closely connected to the principle of subsidiarity, where the idea is that we have an individual responsibility and obligation. You know, rugged individuals are fine as long as those rugged individuals care for others. And the notion really is that we have a positive obligation to help others, especially others in need, most especially the poor. That's the solidarity concept, serving the common good. But at the same time, we need to do that as individuals as sort of close to home as possible. So beginning with the family, beginning with civil institutions, reaching out to family networks, local institutions, civic associations, local government, state government, but in the end, to serve the needs of others, to honor that commitment to the common good and especially honoring the poor, we need to call upon larger communities if and as necessary, never relieving the individual of the responsibility to transact those social obligations, but at the same time being ready, willing, and able to go to ever larger communities to serve the common good, especially to serve the common good of people in need, from the unborn to the unemployed, and virtually anyone else who may have any particular needs that could be met by those around them.
What the Catholic tradition has called subsidiarity, and what the Protestant Abraham Kuyper and his followers have called sphere sovereignty, contain the same basic kernel, namely, that there are civil society institutions, such as the family, the church, and voluntary organizations, that have as much right to exist as does government. Both government and civil society are a part of God's will for society. Both have God-intended roles to play. This insight has enormous practical implications for public policy. It means government's public policies ought to respect and make room for civil society institutions and the good they are doing, not ignore them, and surely not undercut them or try to take over for them. This is an insight that both liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans often miss.
So I don't think it's conservative or liberal. It's just our basic need.
I find myself saying that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It's probably not a conservative idea or a liberal idea. I think there's probably a combination of both ideologies that are going to be effective in that area?
Well, if you're a liberal, you're going to have a problem with subsidiarity. If you're a conservative, you're going to have a problem with subsidiarity. Because it depends on which side of the subsidiarity coin you're looking at. If you're very much concerned about government having too much responsibility and being too big, there's something in subsidiarity for you, because the principle tells you always deliver the care at the unit of society, starting with the individual through church groups, as close as possible to the person or people in need, not letting government usurp that responsibility. So on the one hand. On the other hand, if you're a liberal, you're going to feel a bit like government is the enemy when you look at subsidiarity. You're going to find that it's giving you this sort of bright line test saying you should always try to keep the charity a local call, not make it a long distance call. Yet at the same time, you're going to see subsidiarity saying, well, but if you come up against a big social problem, a big social ill that individuals and church groups and so forth cannot meet on their own, then you have a positive moral obligation to make that long distance call and to involve larger communities up to and including the national political community represented by our democratic government in Washington, D.C.
I kind of lean towards thinking that civil society and organizations like, nonprofits, whatever, do sometimes a much, much, much better job than the government could ever do in taking care of our society. And where the slippery slope comes in then is, well, okay, should the government then jump in and start helping to fund some of these things to allow them to do what they do, rather than the government having to spend, whether us, suddenly essentially putting our tax dollars into some big hole that that could go anywhere. And then is the government going to be dictating to these charities and these organizations how that money is spent?
Yeah, I think it's also dangerous to think in terms of just nonprofits. We need to remember the family and the church and other just friendships and loose relationships that way. And I think it's just a very modern thing when we start to think in terms of organization and fundraising and the mechanisms of organizations. I think that's maybe losing some of the biblical perspective. I didn't see Moses with his 501c3 organizing the the relief of the Israelites.
In 2003, a controversy broke out when Roy Moore, the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, installed a large granite monument in the Alabama court building with the Ten Commandments carved on it. A federal court ordered it removed as a violation of the separation of church and state. In the 1990s, another church-state controversy broke out, this one at the University of Virginia. The university funded 15 different student publications, including some that mocked and poked fun of Christianity. Yet, it refused to fund a Christian publication put out by Ronald Rosenberger and a group of evangelical students.
When I came to the University of Virginia as a student, I found that the only time that Christianity was mentioned in the student media, it was in a derogatory sense. It was either mocked, or there was often anti-clerical, anti-religious types of comments in some of the quote-unquote humor journals that are funded by the university. So I was really seeking a forum for student expression. from a viewpoint that is informed by a larger religious framework. I think it's an equal access issue. I feel like we have been discriminated against purely and simply because of our religious viewpoint, and I think that's intolerable.
The Supreme Court agreed with Ronald Rosenberger and his fellow students. It ruled if the university funded a range of student publications, it was unconstitutional for it not to fund the Christian publication.
Was Judge Moore in the right or in the wrong to put a large stone monument of the Ten Commandments in the Alabama court building? Were Ronald Rosenberger and his fellow students in the right or in the wrong to seek public funds for their paper? The biblical principles we considered earlier can help us to think through church-state questions such as these. Justice as the God-given purpose of governments is one principle that can help us here. Justice means governments should treat all persons and all faiths impartially. The government ought not to discriminate against us as Christians. We should have access to the public realm on an equal basis to anyone else. But neither should the government discriminate against our Jewish or Muslim neighbors. They too deserve equal access to the public realm. Meanwhile, Solidarity says we should be as concerned for the rights of our Jewish and Muslim neighbors as we are for our own. We as Christians ought to work for justice for ourselves, but we should work with equal fervor for justice for our Jewish and Muslim citizens and for our unbelieving neighbors.
If you think in separation terms, you think, well, the public side has to be secular and then religion has to be off in public and private spaces. The equal access concept is to say, no, the public sphere belongs to us all on a non-discriminatory basis. It is not the wall of separation does not mean that the public side has to be secular.
Right.
All it means is that the government may not support some kind of orthodoxy. And when you begin to think about it in those terms, ideas like equal access and non-discrimination become the main norm for the law rather than separation.
The key to evaluating the appropriate relationship between the separate realms of the church and the state is the government's need to be even-handed among persons of all faiths and of none. Equal treatment of all is the key. That is justice. That's why I think the Supreme Court got it right in the University of Virginia case. Equal treatment, or equal access, says that Christian students had as much right for the public funds to promote their views as the other students had for public funds to promote their views.
But what about Judge Moore and his display of the Ten Commandments? Was he acting in keeping with equal access and even-handedness?
I think it's misleading to believe that American law is based on anything other than the Ten Commandments. Maybe we've obviously come really far from that now, but to suggest that they're not related, I think is lying to America. Well, but we can have our commonalities, but to quote scripture of one religion just seems disrespectful to all of the other Americans that don't follow that scripture, even though we have most of those 10 Commandments in common. So there are tons of things that you could quote and important sayings without holding a religion above the other.
It's never really made sense to me. I mean, arguments like for a stone tablet that maybe has religious value and it may communicate something, but I mean, the Christian faith or the hope isn't based upon the erection of, 10 Commandments as an example. I mean, it isn't based on the construction of even church buildings. I mean, our hope is something that is in the body of Christ, which is a missional community which goes out. So, I hear these things and I just have absolutely no interest. Okay, take the 10 Commandments down, put them up. I mean, I would just say they don't probably need to be there. But when people get up there and protest it as though their faith is at stake, to me that seems like, what is your faith based on anyways?
Supreme Court decisions banning teacher-led prayers in public schools are another highly controversial issue.
Hopefully the parents are leading their children in prayer to start off the day, and they haven't, given that responsibility away to the school. But I would say if you're interested in your teacher praying, then take your kids to a Christian school. And if that isn't that big of a deal for you, then okay.
Yeah, we face real challenges because we live in a pluralistic society, and our Constitution is really founded on that. idea that there's going to be equal right under the law no matter what your race, gender, religious background. And so I don't have trouble taking prayer out of the schools. I don't have trouble taking the 10 Commandments down out of that classroom, because if you leave it there, I mean, then what happens in, say, Dearborn, Michigan, where the majority population is Islamic, and suddenly the teacher stands up and starts praying an Islamic prayer, and suddenly you're saying, well, I'm a Christian and I don't want that prayer there. So for the good of the whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a difference between school prayer, which is a religious practice being led and, enforced by a teacher who's in a position of authority, and having, like at the Supreme Court, the 10 Commandments and the Quran and all these other historical bases of the law that we have. One, is a religious practice and is arguably coercive, and the other, I think, is an important political symbol of kind of where we came from and the values we hold dear, and a reminder that law isn't just created by man, but it's something that's given by God. And I think those are useful reminders without exactly proselytizing or enforcing a particular view.
Some have suggested that instead of teacher-led prayers in the public schools, there should be a moment of silence at the start of the school day for prayer or reflection. Others have said the answer is for Christian students to be allowed to meet for prayer and fellowship before or after the school day.
Why bother? If that's all that can happen, if the kids aren't allowed to discuss anything afterwards or express anything, and if the teachers aren't allowed to assist or guide the students, then let's just leave the schools what they say they're out there to do, and do math and science and history, and forget about anything else.
I personally don't have a problem with a moment of silence. I don't think it's necessary, but I also don't think it's prohibited.
Definitely I wouldn't support the classroom scenario, but if there's a way for students to get together to pray beforehand, after, maybe they're in an enclosed room, so they're not like in some public space and students have to walk around them like at a flagpole before or after school, that would make a lot of sense to me.
Christians should be allowed to meet in non-academic time. Say, for example, when you have the National Day of Prayer and students gather around the flagpole. As a public school teacher, I've seen that happen. I've stood around the flagpole, and it creates a tremendous sense of unity. It gives people an opportunity to express themselves and their faith, and there has to be something deeper underlying a society, I think. You can't just, even in the public school system, there should be, in families, among the students, there should be some underlying principles and moral values that help underpin the schools.
Not Dead Yet is a national disability rights group, a secular group that opposes the legalization of various forms of what we would call medical killing, assisted suicide, active euthanasia, and non-voluntary or involuntary passive euthanasia, which is euthanasia through the withholding of medical treatment that is not with the consent of the person who is being denied treatment that will result in their death. Our concern is that people who are old, ill, or disabled are devalued in this society, And we face a healthcare system that includes severe cutbacks from the governmental side, heavy pressures from managed care and the insurance industry that wants to maintain profits. And that means old, ill, and disabled people essentially being devalued. And we're concerned with the great risk of abuse in a system like that and in a society that basically views these individuals as worth less or worthless.
The organization, Not Dead Yet, does not take a position on abortion or other issues dealing with the unborn, but others testify to the issue of human life raised by abortion.
Going to school full-time as a freshman in college and working full-time, met this guy. So when I found out I was pregnant, I expected him to be excited about it. I expected it to be an okay thing. And for me, it was kind of like, since I felt like I kind of lost my family in a way, and, it was a chance. I thought, now we can start a new family. But within 5 minutes, that whole mystical happily ever after was pretty quickly flushed down the drain, because when I came out of the bathroom after taking the pregnancy test and told him, he just went off. And I just remember begging and crying and, please, don't make me do this. He said, no, you're having an abortion, period. End of story. There's not going to be any discussion about this. As bad as all the physical stuff was, I would say emotionally it was 100 times worse. It was just, I went from being somebody who loved kids, loved to be around kids, I have lots of little brothers and sisters, and always was the person doing nursery and daycare, and to just not even being able to stand the sight of a child, or especially a baby or a newborn. I would just break down. I would have an anxiety attack.
The world indeed is not as it is supposed to be. Young girls become pregnant under awful circumstances where they are pressured to have abortions. Accident or disease strikes and leaves persons working to overcome severe disabilities.
One reason why we have to be very sensitive and very supportive of human life, and why we need to think about the sanctity, indeed even the holiness of human life, is simply the fact that all human beings are created in the image of God, and that it's our job to honor God's creating purposes. One of my heroes, Abraham Kuyper, once said that God is like an artist who is in love with his work, and even when somebody sort of tries to destroy that work or puts funny lines through it that destroy the beauty of it, that the artist still looks at that as something that he created and something that he loves. Psalm 139 is a key text here, where the psalmist says, "When I was in my mother's womb, you knit me together." Yeah. And that sense that we're divine artworks, and that God has created us, and that when we see the other person, we have to appreciate the intention of the artist who created that person. To me, that's a very strong biblical theme.
You see, it's not politically correct to stand in a pulpit, in a church, in a synagogue, in a parish, and say, God loves life. Not politically correct. But friends, if we don't stand for life, we'll find ourselves saying, you know what? I'm really pro-life, but somebody else wants to abort their child. Why should I say anything? What's the difference in saying, I personally am opposed to slavery, but if someone else wants to own slaves, that's their business. No different.
140 years ago, we as a nation rightly decided it would be unjust for someone to own a slave. Our public policies no longer allow this to be a matter of individual choice. Similarly, if human beings created in God's image and justice as the God-given purpose of government mean anything, they mean government must protect human life, not stand idly by while individuals end it. And if the Christian's duty is to stand in solidarity with those who are weak and vulnerable means anything, it means we need to work to protect unborn life and those suffering debilitating injuries or diseases. But that is only half the story.
The budget cuts in the healthcare system that are being imposed by some components in the conservative movement as part of tax cutting are really a contradiction to the valuing of life and the need to provide health care and support services to old, ill, and disabled people. And we hope that true Christians, people who endorse the values of that religion, will support true healthcare provision through our government and our private system and recognize the contradiction of cutting healthcare and that it really is a form of backdoor euthanasia.
As a supporter of the right to life cause, I obviously believe strongly in the sanctity of unborn human beings, and that God wants us to honor and to respect life even before it becomes a full-fledged human being. But one of the great inconsistencies among those of us who have promoted the right to life is that we haven't always shown the same kind of valuing of life after people are born, nor have we valued and been shown a compassion for young women, victims of rape, or even people who've made stupid mistakes sexually, who get themselves into situations where they have to deal with the tragedy of an unwanted pregnancy. And I think that those of us who are right-to-life people need to provide the kind of support systems, adoption, but also support systems for people who are struggling with sometimes the very tragic circumstances of giving birth.
Yeah, I'm pro-life, which is why I support crisis pregnancy centers and adoption services and so on. And I guess I find his comment a little incorrect in that I think most of the support for young women facing crisis pregnancies or who've been kicked out of the home because they're pregnant or who are just trying to deal with this issue, most of the advice and support comes from people who are on the right to life side of things.
I would probably resonate with what Matt said in terms of the media. It seems probably just demonizes a bit the religious right who's there to stand against abortion but not stand with the women who choose to have one or to not have one. So I'm certain that there's always room for more to be done.
This leaves us with the question of government and the role of public policy in providing help to women and young girls facing crisis pregnancies, and to those who are severely sick or disabled. Remember subsidiarity, sphere sovereignty, and the importance of civil society? They can help us here. They say that civil society and its institutions like families, churches, and nonprofit organizations are a part of God's will and can and should play a role in meeting the needs of the sick and severely disabled, those facing crisis pregnancies, and single mothers.
We talked about civil society earlier, that there's a huge role for the church and other organizations to play in terms of providing an alternative to walk with these women, whether they've chosen to or have not chosen to. And that if they don't play that role, I think the danger in the political process is that because you're against, you kind of feel like you can wipe your hands clean. Well, I'm against people killing their unborn kids, and then you just get to walk away. And again, time is scarce, and we talked about that in the beginning. So it's not as though you can get involved with every cause, but I hope people would be as passionate, if not more, about walking with, finding alternatives for
than just simply advocating against.
Well, Christ definitely talks about caring for the widows and the orphans, and these women and children, could easily fit into that category, and it doesn't put a time limit on that. So I would suggest that the church ought to take care of these children through adulthood, and and for the mothers, through the time when if they've chosen to keep the child, then through their entire child rearing.
Government may need to partner with civil society organizations. Private, often faith-based groups can provide the love and care that government has a hard time providing, and government can provide the legal backing and finances that private groups often lack. The key need for us as Christian citizens is to sort out what our families, churches, and nonprofit groups can best provide, and what our government can best provide.
I grew up in a pretty typical working class family in the 50s and 60s. It was a big family. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and that's really what I wanted. Some of my friends went off to college. I had no desire to really do that, so my goal was to raise my family and be a full-time mom and wife, and met the man that I ended up marrying and decided that I would work so he could go to school and he would have income sufficient for us to raise our family. We've been married a little over 3 years, but I became pregnant a little earlier than we planned. But we had our little boy, and then even more unexpectedly, I found myself pregnant a second time, and that put a lot of pressure on. And eventually the result of that was, just as he was finishing up his internship to get his certifications and had started a job, he decided it was too much responsibility, and that played out in him becoming involved with somebody else and caused a lot of difficulty in our marriage, and eventually he left and the marriage was over. When he left, I had $9.29 in a checkbook. That was it. Well, after 2 months of not being able to pay the babysitter, no matter how hard I stretched things, and at that point, really, I had no choice, and much to my dismay, I found myself somewhere I never, ever dreamed I would be. So I went to social services and applied and was eligible, and then tried to look at what's next. But one of the workers looked at where I was with my schooling, had talked to me fairly extensively, and asked if I was going to continue going to school. And I said, well, the only way I can do that is to do it part-time, hopefully find another job, and get a Pell Grant and get assistance to cover books and tuition. And some professors really encouraged me to continue. I continued my education. So I was on welfare for a total of 9 months. And, it was an amazingly humbling experience.
There is much we can learn from Patty's story. She experienced poverty and was at her wit's end through no fault of her own. A government program funded with our tax dollars came to her rescue and enabled her to obtain the education she needed to leave welfare, support herself and her family, and contribute to society. Admittedly, not all persons on welfare are as deserving as what Patty was, nor do they all take advantage of the opportunities given them as she did, but many do. It's simply wrong to put all poor people into one easy-to-condemn pigeonhole. We begin our consideration of poverty by noting one basic point the Bible makes time and time again.
Psalm 146 says, "The God of Jacob is a God who takes up the cause of the widow and the orphan." The God of Jacob is the one who takes up the cause of the poor. God is an advocate on behalf of the poor. And it's so important for us to understand the spiritual teaching there. That over and over again, God says to the people of Israel, "You were once orphans in the land of Egypt, and I heard your cries." Our obligation to the poor has a lot to do with the fact that God has reached out to us in our own helplessness, and that we in turn need to reach out to those who are helpless, maybe in very different ways. Helpless because of the structures of oppression or poverty or prejudice and the like. But it's very important for us to take up the cause of the poor, because God issues a warning that if we don't take up the cause of those who need someone to stand up for them, how will we stand in the day of judgment?
Most Christians agree we have a God-given duty to help the poor. The principle of solidarity surely requires this. But what does that mean in concrete terms today? What should we do as individuals, and what government policies should we support? The Old Testament laws that required the Israeli farmers to leave some of the grain in the fields for the poor to glean are a good place to begin as we think about these questions.
And so there's a condemnation in the scriptures of those who are poor because of their own refusal to work. And I think those gleaning laws are really an encouragement not just to take the handout, but to actually go and get that grain on your own. It's not easy to go from ancient laws for an agricultural setting to contemporary business practices. But there are some underlying principles there that I'm positive we have to take into account as biblical Christians. And that notion that the farmer in the Old Testament, who is reaping the grain, was required to leave some off on the edges there so that the poor could come and take some of that. The underlying principle there was, it's not all about us. It's not all about my profit. It's not all about what it can mean for me in terms of economic interests. But even in conducting my daily business, I need to think about the concerns of the poor.
Justice as a biblical principle is central. We are to treat the poor with justice, to work to assure that they have opportunities to provide for themselves and improve their situation. Today, this means educational and job training programs, not leaving some crops for the poor to harvest, but the principle is the same. Justice means we as a society owe something to the poor, but they also have a duty to take advantage of the opportunities they have been given.
There was some level of required activity on the part of the poor. They actually had to show up to the land. They themselves had to do the work of gathering what it was they needed.
That old adage or proverb that if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day, but if you teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. I think we need to operate out of that kind of philosophy. We need to equip people who are struggling with skills, with education. We need to focus on their strengths, and we need to help teach them how to help themselves out of poverty. So when government programs operate in that fashion, then I'm all in favor.
In addition to the principle of justice, there is the biblical principle that insists on the importance of civil society and the need for public policies when helping the poor to work with and not undercut and replace the many Christian and other nonprofit agencies already doing much to help the poor. Breakthrough Urban Ministries in Chicago is a model of Christian faith in action. It can help us understand that helping the poor is not a matter of only private action or only government action. Sometimes the two working in partnership is the best answer.
Our Christian faith is central to everything that we do at Breakthrough. It's our mission to demonstrate the compassion of Christ, and we do this through Bible studies and devotional times and our one-on-one interactions with everybody that comes to us. We have more than 1,000 volunteers that come and serve here at Breakthrough. They provide meals for our homeless guests, they tutor, they coach, they mentor, they do building projects with us and sort clothes and clean. We're very grateful for our volunteers. We also have a majority of our revenue coming from private donations and family foundations. More than 50% comes from people who just really care about our mission and want to give us unrestricted funds because they believe in what we're doing and they see that the benefit that it's providing to the community and to the kingdom. And then we get about 20% of our revenue from government sources, everything from the neighborhood to the city to the state and the federal government for things like housing and employment training. And these dollars are very helpful for us. We don't depend on the government for what we do. We try not to be funding driven. We want to stick with our mission, but all of these revenue sources are very helpful for us. To have a diverse funding base is key.
Our Lower Sutter and Breakthrough Urban Ministries are examples of civil society in action. Government is a part of God's will for human society, but so are families, churches, and nonprofit agencies such as Breakthrough Ministries. Remember the principle of subsidiarity? It says that government ought not to take over from civil society organizations that are already helping the poor. Instead, government can often best assist the poor by helping to fund organizations such as Breakthrough Urban Ministries that are already doing good work, and in other ways cooperate with them and support their work.
In 2002, an organization called the Evangelical Environmental Network received national media attention when it launched its What Would Jesus Drive campaign.
As evangelicals, we asked the question, what would Jesus do? And then that obviously led to, hey, well, what about what would Jesus drive, as a way of kind of being a little bit humorous and getting people's attention, but at the same time helping them focus a little bit. One of the ways that we as individuals impact God's creation is by our transportation choices. Even though at first folks might have thought, well, this is kind of humorous, but what does it have to do with anything in terms of being a Christian? It really has some serious implications for those of us who follow Christ.
Other Christians disagreed with the campaign. One comic suggested Jesus would probably have driven a big SUV so he could take all his disciples with him.
I personally favor the What Would Jesus Drive campaign, but whatever one thinks of it, it was based on a basic point that all Christians should embrace, namely, God takes a delight in his creation and cares deeply about it and how we human beings use it.
G.K. Chesterton once said that God is a lot like little kids, more like kids than he is like adults. And that is a little kid. My grandson, I'll make a funny face and he'll say, "Do it again, Grandpa." And I'll do it again. And he laughs as hard the second time as he did the first time. And Chesterton says every day God looks at the hawk and God says to the hawk, "Do it again." God looks at the rivers and the trees and he says, "Do it again." Looks at the sun and he says, "Do it again." That God takes delight in the proper functioning of his creation, and God sustains and nurtures and upholds that creation. And the promises that we have in the scriptures are not just about individuals getting saved and going to heaven, but that all creatures, great and small, will someday sing glory and praise to God. I don't understand the mystery of all of that, but someday the wolf and the lamb will lie together. Someday little kids won't have to be afraid of snakes. Someday nature, the creation itself, will flourish because it isn't just about us. It's about the flourishing of a good creation.
So the Lord is the owner. We're simply the stewards. And we were called to care for His creation, tend and keep the garden. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. It's not ours to destroy. We have been given stewardship of it.
I think there is in the scriptures a kind of warning. In Revelation 11:18, it goes like this: I will destroy those who destroy the earth. Wow. I can't even begin to imagine what that means. But I do know this, it's a warning. When we die, we will have to answer the question, what did you do with what I gave you, this earth, this creation? And that's a very serious question.
Justice means making sure the natural environment and all the creatures in it receive their due as God's creation, about which He cares deeply and in which He delights. And solidarity means we must guard against our using up Earth's resources in a way that means there will be less for others of God's image bearers with whom we share this planet, and for future generations. We need to keep in mind that the question of pollution is more than a matter of pristine vistas and lakes to enjoy while on vacation. For many, they are a matter of life and death.
There are some serious consequences to our air pollution and our water pollution. We can take mercury as an example. It's a dangerous neurotoxin, especially for the unborn and for children, because their brains are still developing. And so mercury's impact on the unborn, you hear a lot about how pregnant women shouldn't eat fish with a certain amount of mercury in it, that kind of thing. But usually that's not talked about that, hey, the real reason why they shouldn't is because it's impacting the unborn. We don't want to have our children have birth defects, have brain damage due to air pollution, mercury pollution. So that's one way that air pollution is having a serious impact on vulnerable populations here in this country. There have been some recent studies that have suggested that air pollution can actually help cause asthma in healthy children. And we are seeing a real uptick in the number of children who have asthma in this country.
Frankly, the impact on the earth today by climate change, otherwise known as global warming, has a far different level of impact than anything ever experienced on the face of this globe. Namely that the earth itself might be so damaged that tipping points would be reached beyond which it's impossible to return. In other words, putting so much CO2, greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere, forming a greening effect, which will produce all kinds of negative consequences.
Not caring properly for God's creation can also lead to the extinction of plant and animal species. Scientists estimate that about 1,000 species are becoming extinct every year because of human actions.
I think if you kind of look at the fact that we are one creature who is unfortunately extinguishing other creatures who are made by God and declared to be good in Genesis 1, we're taking away their provision that God gave to them. That's not stewardship. As one of my colleagues says, extinction isn't stewardship.
Our relationship with the environment isn't ultimately about our relationship with the environment, though. It's about our relationship with God. And if we refuse to treat the environment with respect and stewardship because it's not going to make a difference anyway, then we're not obeying God and being a good steward, even if we look at it as a hopeless cause.
There's an interdependence there, and I think there's also a trickiness because different people can have different values, different interests. Where do animals in relationship to humans and in some kind of hierarchy, if someone's willing to even conceive of such a thing, that's going to change the way people engage this conversation. I would agree that stewardship is not extinction, but I do think the conversation is difficult.
This is where government and its public policies come in. Our individual actions are important as a testimony to what God has called us to be and to do as stewards of His creation. But the actions of any one of us, no matter how commendable they are, will have only a limited impact for good on the creation and its creatures. At the same time, God has given us government to resist the results of sin in this world and to promote greater justice. This has a direct relevance to protecting the natural environment from pollution, species extinction, and climate change. When it comes to protecting God's creation, government and its public policies are needed more often than in most other public policy areas. We need to act together as a society. But this does not yet make crafting good public policies that protect God's creation an easy matter. Many questions remain. For one, there's the issue of trade-offs. To protect God's creation, there usually is some sort of a cost, at least in the short run. Lost jobs by some persons, increased costs to produce certain products, perhaps higher taxes.
Yeah, I don't think we should lay waste to species, but at the same time, it is difficult because if you look at the places where there's the most species loss, they're also the places where people are the poorest. And the reason habitat is being lost is people are trying to eke out a living. They're trying to escape poverty. And if we're supposed to be stewards of the environment and care about poverty, then we reach a point where we have to ask the question, how do we strike the balance? And I think it's arrogant of some environmentalists to assume it's just an easy question. Well, you just preserve the habitat.
We definitely need balance. We need to seek environmental stewardship, and yet we are going to have to harvest natural resources and continue economic progress or development in areas like the Third World. And so we've got to do a better job of finding that balance.
One night they found me on the riverside when I baptized people, and they came and they caught us and they are asking the new believers to deny Jesus. These believers, they haven't been in the church for a year or for 2 years, or even they haven't read their Bibles. They know only one verse, which Dr. Eshelman gave it to me when I became saved, John 3:16. They know only that verse. And they are asking them to deny Jesus, and they said, no, we are not denying Jesus. We are Islam till today, but we don't have any peace. We don't have any insurance that we are going to have eternal life. And now we know we have eternal life and we are not returned back. And they got killed in front of my eyes, 2 of them. And then my turn came and they are asking me why I am doing this. I told them God gave me this and I was authorized by God to evangelize people, and I am answering the Great Commission. And then they hang me upside down and they start to pour boiling oil over my feet, and they're starting to give me a slash with a wire cable. I asked God, it's really painful when they put that boiling oil over my feet. It's really very, very difficult, and I can't deny it. You know, I was painful, I was terrified, and I am really ready to deny Jesus. Between that, the Holy Spirit helped me, and I ask this, God, please take me home. I can't take this anymore.
I think it's a wake-up call to us, because I don't know that as a culture, or as a Christian culture like we claim to be, that we could stand up to that sort of persecution. Yeah. I don't think we could do it.
I experienced a deep sadness and sympathy for those people. Very often in my own experience, I've been very comfortable. I have not been challenged with those kind of hard questions or hard situations. And so I feel a bit guilty in that it's so much easier for me. I'm not put in that position where I have to stand, where my life is on the line, and then stand up for my faith, which I hope and I pray that I would.
We're so protected in our neat little neighborhoods in the U.S., and we don't know that these things are going on. And at the same time, just, again, that overwhelm, that what am I supposed to do about it?
Some have tried to estimate the number of martyrs, Christian martyrs, and the numbers are astoundingly high. I'm not sure how those numbers are formulated. I've seen a number of 160,000 a year. That seems like an awful lot of people to me. But if it's only one, then recently we've had a situation where there's a fear now in North Korea that a Christian pastor has been executed. The fact is that people are still being martyred. I don't know the extent, I don't know the final numbers, but anytime we see in the 21st century people bearing the ultimate sacrifice for their faith, it sobers us, it challenges us, it should revolt us, and we should continue to work to do everything possible to eliminate it altogether.
Another major human rights issue in today's world is modern-day slavery, and especially that of young girls and women being forced into prostitution and held as slaves.
I think along with religious freedom, there are other issues, obviously, that impact our human rights, what it means to be distinctively human. A free choice given to us within the gift of a gift from a sovereign God. It's just mind-blowing, a kind of a situation as we have been created. But it does include not simply religious freedoms, but the freedom of one's person. Sex trafficking, as an example, a negative example, is again a terrible affront to humanity. And it's gone on in some amazing countries. It's not just in the backwoods of the world. We see it in first world countries as well. And it's a horrible abuse, treating women as subjects in the extreme. And it essentially takes women, assigns a price to them, and puts them into a marketable economic system, which again just trivializes, demoralizes, traumatizes what it means to be distinctively human.
One thing about it is a lot of the sex trafficking overseas in particular is our fault as Americans and consumers of that trade. So I think at the very least raising awareness, a lot of people don't know that it's going on, and a lot of people don't know that a lot of Americans are to blame for it.
I do think there is obviously an element of powerlessness as it relates to religious persecution, or as it relates to sex trafficking.
I learn more about a social justice issue or a poverty issue, and okay, so what's my part to play? The resources, the little quick answers of how I can be involved and how I can do something about that are usually so far down the conversation that by the time we get to finding out what we can do about it, I'm already so frustrated and feeling useless.
One thing is clear: a sense of Christian solidarity with our fellow believers suffering persecution, and with young girls and women being held as slaves in brothels, means unconcern is not an option God allows us. The responsibilities of American Christians are increased by our having a major influence in the most powerful country in the world today. This is an area where American evangelicals have already made a difference. In 1998, Congress passed and President Clinton signed the milestone International Religious Freedom Act. Evangelicals played an important role in securing its passage.
And the bill was passed unanimously. Given the fact that this was 1998, this was truly amazing. Nothing was getting through the political machinations of Washington, D.C. unscathed in 1998. This bill did. And it put the world on notice, and it put us on notice, that people who had lost their voice in terms of religious freedom, those who were being persecuted throughout the world, the United States would stand up and take their part. And in the halls of power, those halls of power would become the halls of justice for voiceless people around the world. And again, given the political dynamic going on in our own country, it was amazing legislation, and I don't think it would have had the kind of passage, and maybe passage at all, if the evangelical community had not been a part of it.
But this does not mean working for more justice in a world of persecution and slavery is easy, nor that the path we should take is obvious. Equally sincere Christians can disagree on the exact policies that we should pursue. Remember the importance of civil society and the many organizations that make it up? There are many private, nonprofit organizations actively opposing religious persecution and slavery. Among them are evangelical agencies such as World Vision, Samaritan's Purse, and World Relief. This leads to a very basic question. Should we urge our government to work through existing, often Christian, nonprofit agencies to end religious persecution and sex trafficking? Or should our government itself work directly to solve these problems?
Yeah, I think absolutely both. The government, the American government, I think has a responsibility to denounce countries that are putting people at risk, and certainly, especially children and young girls and boys too, and denouncing it through whatever means necessary, whether it be sanctions or whatever that might be. Also, private organizations do a great job of, especially like in countries like Thailand, where private organizations can go in and get the girls and work very closely with these girls and these boys to get them out of the situations that they're in. So I think both is very important.
Another question that often comes up is whether we can better encourage change in governments that are involved in persecution or sex trafficking by using economic and diplomatic pressures, or can we better encourage change by developing trade, educational, and cultural contacts in the hope that we can gradually influence that other country away from what it is doing?
Yeah, I also think there's a danger sometimes that when we denounce countries, we may actually cause resistance to change because they don't want to look like they're kowtowing to foreign pressure. And so I think we need to be careful that we apply pressure carefully and maybe as a last resort, and try to see if we can bring about change in other ways too.
I think that soft power in this area is going to be far more effective. Matt's right when he says if we use economic pressure or military, the threat of military force, it's going to have the opposite effect of what would be desired. We've definitely got to create those economic and cultural ties, opening dialogue, participatory engagement as opposed to trying to use force or any kind of coercion.
In 1900, Africa had 10 million Christians, representing 10% of the population. By 2000, that 10 million had grown to 360 million, representing just under half the population, and it's still growing. In statistical terms, that is the largest religious change that has ever occurred on the planet of any kind, and most of us didn't even see it.
Meanwhile, a 2005 official British commission concluded, African poverty and stagnation is the greatest tragedy of our times.
One of the great paradoxes in today's world is that the continent where Christianity is experiencing its greatest growth is the very continent where human poverty, disease, and political instability are the greatest.
In sub-Saharan Africa, the estimate is about 2 to 2.5 million people are dying of AIDS each year. Again, it's a bit difficult to know exact numbers because a lot of times people don't admit that they have AIDS, and doctors are very unwilling to write that on a death certificate. A lot of times people who die of TB or malaria or pneumonia might be a complication or an opportunistic infection that has come because of being HIV positive. So it's hard to know exact numbers, but UNAIDS, which is the United Nations agency that collects all this data, provides the number of roughly, I think last year they provided the number of 2.1 million people in sub-Saharan Africa.
To some, the problems of Africa appear so great they are tempted to give way to despair and hopelessness. But the good news of the Bible is that no matter how dark the night, Christ, not evil, is in charge. Jesus Christ and His grace are active in the world today. This is also true of Africa.
Africa is a continent rich in natural and human resources. Pastor Isaac Matua of Katali, Kenya, expressed this truth well when he wrote, Africa is suffering, not because of scarcity, but because of what she has not utilized. God is reminding us that He is ready to liberate Africa from her problems, if her people will avail themselves and make use of what He has given them.
When we note the problems Africa is facing today, we need to remember that many who are facing these problems are our brothers and sisters in Christ. The great biblical principle of solidarity says we owe Africa our prayers and concern and our help. When one part of the church is suffering, surely the other part of the church needs to act.
I think one of the most important things that Americans can do is that they can continue to care about AIDS in Africa. And not just about AIDS, but about Africa. Foreign assistance to Africa, and particularly for AIDS and health issues, has gone up dramatically under the Bush administration. But the only reason that happens is if Americans care, and if they talk to their congressman and they join important interest groups on those issues. So I really think that's the most important thing, because to fight AIDS in Africa, Africa needs resources. African states just don't have the resources to provide antiretroviral drugs, to provide the testing that's needed to test pregnant women, to provide the massive care that's needed for orphans and vulnerable children. They have to have outside assistance.
I think the United States definitely has issues of its own with poverty. There are many people in the United States who are living in extreme conditions, and but the difference is we in the United States have the resources available to these people to use if they choose to. The social services agencies are there, and the money and the resources are in place for people to go to. In countries, in the African countries, those resources aren't available.
With the encouragement of many Christians and others, President Bush began the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR. It involves spending billions of dollars in Africa and elsewhere to battle against the AIDS epidemic. Much of this money is being funded through Christian organizations, such as MAP International.
The U.S. government voted in 2003 over 15 billion.
15 billion?
US dollars to support 15 countries, 12 of them in Africa, 2 in the Caribbean, Haiti and Guyana, and then 1 in Asia, Vietnam. So my role at MAP International, and this other new role as Senior Director, Health and Hope, is to work with the churches and faith-based groups to see how they can plug into the governments within their countries and how they could also benefit from some of these monies. Those go through governments, but also through some large NGOs.
Okay, and like, the NGOs and
non-governmental organizations like World Vision, World Relief, and then MAP International, partnering with some of these organizations. Also, we access some of that money.
At many points, we have talked about the role played by civil society organizations in God's ordering of human societies. Dr. Peter O'Callaghan and his efforts are a living example of what those ideas mean. Others are also catching this vision.
Local congregations are the best organization to eradicate the disease. We have the largest distribution network, we have the greatest number of volunteers, and we possess the most credibility at the local village level. Businesses and governments and NGO will never be able to eradicate this epidemic without the local churches involved around the world.
Other Christian leaders are coming together to say that Christian overseas agencies are the best means to meet the needs of Africa. But they are also saying they cannot do it alone. When the financial resources of our government are combined with the dedication and the grassroots networks of faith-based overseas organizations, one has a combination that may very well be equal to the enormous needs Africa is facing today.
Well, the question is often raised best as follows. Does money that's given to foreign governments best serve those people in countries such as Africa, or does money that's given to non-governmental organizations best serve the recipients? And this is an ongoing debate here in Washington. I think that history would show that often dollars that go to foreign governments have historically, particularly in Africa, gone to the rich, the wealthy, the entitled, often to tyrants, rather than to who ought to be the recipients of these dollars. And so I think that President Bush's PEPFAR plan, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, in which money went to non-governmental organizations such as World Vision, World Relief, and Compassion International, and others, these kinds of non-governmental organizations are best shown to be more efficient, cost-effective. They aren't used, dollars aren't used to prop up tyrants, and so I happen to prefer that methodology.
People who are driven by other motives, who don't care about legacy, who are not worried about the next election, they will stay at the table. They will bring the credibility, they will bring the relevance, they will bring the impact to get the job done. Government has been smart. They have looked at faith-based organizations as an extension of the humanitarian reach. They've had to. It's practical. Now, do you give money? Do you give goods? Do you give help to a faith-based organization just because it's faith-based? No. You give it only because they can get the job done better than you can get the job done. If that's the case, then there should not be any limits.
You know, I think it is definitely more than a financial issue, though, and sometimes it gets confused to just be, well, let's donate this, X number of dollars in aid. But I think history has proven that we've been doing that, and for certain reasons there hasn't been things that have been changing, at least on a scale that maybe we would hope it would change in light of the money that's been given. And so, I mean, you mentioned issues like corrupt government, and there are a host of issues. So I think if someone with their own tax money has certain ideas of what that should go to, I would have a conversation with them. But I think churches have a really unique role to play.
And they're overwhelming problems. And the church does have a role to play, but again, in a larger picture, we as American Christians, we do have to use government and government policy to educate and make people aware of the economic situations, the role that we play as an economic driver in the world. And I think we need to work to change that, to make a change.
And alongside of Africa, all these statistics that were given about things that are going bad, the church is growing quite a bit there. And we talked about the civil society. The society of the church, I think, has a profound role to play in addressing issues like HIV and AIDS.
September 11, 2001. On that date, the United States was attacked by Al-Qaeda, a splinter group of ruthless militant Muslims. The lives of almost 3,000 people were taken that day. That attack was followed by other attacks in Bali, Indonesia, Madrid, and London. Hundreds of additional lives were lost. The United States responded by working to ferret out Al-Qaeda cells and by attacking Afghanistan and overthrowing its regime that had been harboring Al-Qaeda. Then the United States attacked Iraq and overthrew the brutal regime of Saddam Hussein. The fighting, destruction, and deaths continue today.
Our nation's ongoing long-term struggle against the violent Islamist movement raises many questions for the thoughtful Christian. First, we need to understand why, whenever we think things have gotten better and we are looking forward to an era of peace, violence and war break out all over again.
The people in the Old Testament knew what the psalmist was talking about when he talked about the terror by night and the arrow that flies at noonday. Terror and war are very difficult realities, and they're a part of our sinful world, and we have to struggle with how we can best respond to the facts of violence and war and terrorism in the world.
Truly, war and terrorism are a part of our broken, sinful world. But what does this mean as our nation faces the challenges of terrorists bent on our destruction? Does this mean our government should itself resort to war and the killing that goes with war?
God calls governments to do justice. Romans 13 doesn't just tell us we should obey government and whatever it does, but it says that it's the task of government to punish those who do evil and to reward those who do good. And terrorists are certainly evildoers, and so I believe that governments have a very clear obligation to protect us against terrorism, but they need to do so in such a way that at the same time they're not being destroyed by the enemy within, by a spirit of vengeance, by being so overtaken with fear that we end up doing unjust things ourselves.
It does present some challenge in that when I listen to Christ's call to love my enemy, to pray for my enemy, to turn the other cheek, it's tough when you're dealing with a radicalized group that is, say, suicidal, willing to die for their beliefs. It's very difficult then to say, I'm going to turn the other cheek when they're getting onto a bus full of people and blowing up innocents. So it does present some challenges as a Christian to find the proper use of force. Some force may be necessary. Some hard lines may need to be drawn in the sand. And yet the slippery slope then is that that the pendulum swings too far, that we pursue our objectives at all costs.
The idea that we should do whatever it takes always makes me nervous. Somewhere there has to be the kind of love that doesn't let us be treated poorly, but also treats that person with respect because of who they are as a creation of God and not what they've done.
Even Christians who insist that the God-given, justice-pursuing role of government allows for governments to use force to protect their citizens and thwart the efforts of those who are plotting evil, also insist with equal strength that governments in the use of deadly force must observe certain limits. An anything-goes attitude is not right. Down through the centuries, Christians have struggled with the question of what limits should a justice-promoting government observe as it uses even deadly force and warfare in its pursuit of justice. We today, as followers of Jesus Christ, need to struggle with that question as we respond to the horror of 9/11 and the terrorists who would do us great harm. That question is not easy to answer can be seen in some remarks President Bush made immediately after 9/11.
On September 14, 2001, President Bush spoke to a mourning nation from the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. In that address, he proclaimed, "Our responsibility to history is already clear, to answer these attacks and rid the world of evil." 6 days later, he addressed a joint session of Congress and declared, "Our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated."
President Bush, with these words, promised to rid the world of evil and to find, stop, and defeat every terrorist group of global reach. We need to ask ourselves, are these appropriate, realistic goals? Do they observe the sort of limits that biblical principles suggest we ought to impose on ourselves?
For those of us who are not pacifists, who believe that there are times when a nation has to go to war against another nation in order to do justice, to correct really horrible things. Obviously, the war against the Nazis was a clear case in point for this. But for a Christian, it's so important for us to think about the spirituality of warfare. St. Augustine, who introduced the just war guidelines for nations, said at one point that as we go about trying to destroy our enemies, we have to be very careful not to ourselves be destroyed by the enemy within. And then he said something amazing. He said, it's so important that even warfare be conducted with kindness. Now, that's a puzzling thing. But I think what St. Augustine was saying was that if we see even our enemy, our worst enemy, the Saddam Husseins and the Hitlers, as also created in the image of God, that we may very well have to do very harsh things to correct their behavior and maybe even to bring them to death. But that we ought never to do it with a spirit of vengeance, with a cruel attitude that could itself destroy us within. And so there's a spirituality of dealing with terrorism and with warfare that's a very important part of the Christian life and often gets ignored by biblical Christians.
Yeah, I think for me this is probably the most complex, or one of the more complicated questions.
Government's always about, at some point, the use of violence or the use of force. And if we believe the government is ordained by God for particular reasons, then we have to start thinking about under which circumstances ought we to use violence. What is important enough, or at what point are we obligated to kill, or are we ever?
But for the Christian, being destroyed by terrorists is not the worst thing in the world. The worst thing in the world is what the Apostle Paul talks about in that wonderful passage in the Epistle to the Romans, where he says that the real threat is to be separated from the love of God in Jesus Christ. And so we have a very special obligation as people who do not consider the threat of terrorism to be the worst thing in the world. We have a very special obligation to remind our government that it's quite possible for a government in legitimately protecting citizens against terrorism to do things itself that can destroy our souls. And that's a very important thing for us to be talking about today, that we cannot be carried away by anger, by a spirit of vengeance, by winning at any cost. And we have a special obligation to tell the world that terrorism isn't the biggest threat. What's the biggest threat is that we be separated from the love of God in Jesus Christ.
So I don't know how you balance those two things, though. Separation from God, not death, is the only thing we ought to fear. Then terrorism really isn't, a problem to us in the long run, but definitely in the short run, while we're living here, we need to deal with it.
Well, I think he's provided an important caution, right? We can't let vengeance govern our policies. We can't strike out in anger. we need to be very careful about how we deal with this.
There are some times, I think, where it's okay for a Christian or a just society to kill or even wage war to prevent worse outcomes from happening. And that's not just a let's let the ends justify the means approach. There are definitely limits. There are things that we must not do under any circumstances. But this is a fallen world, and I feel that that my faith allows room to do what we have to within certain limitations to rescue the innocent.